Welcome back, brothers, to lore. Tonight we're diving into a new lore on the return of Perturabo as a Daemon prince. Before we get into the madness, be sure to like, comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for another beer. I want to thank you guys for support. I've been killing it like usual. Now, let's get to the video.
Medangard knew no dawn worthy of the name. Its light did not rise. It bled. Far above the demon world, a black sun hung behind curtains of smog and furnace ash. A wounded thing shackled in the bruise-coloured heavens, like a heart ripped from some ancient god, and left to rot over an empire of iron. The light that fell from it was thin and malignant, a dead radiance that struck the mountains and did not warm them. It glazed the fortress ranges in a sheen like old oil upon stagnant water. It limned the towers that rose in impossible profusion from the world's crust, their upper reaches lost in clouds the colour of cauterized flesh. It made every bastion and parapet, every chain bridge and gun platform, every gargantuan manufactorum and artillery cathedral seem carved not from stone, but from hatred given form. The mountains of Medangard were not mountains in the natural sense. They had been quarried, flensed, drilled through, fortified, hollowed and remade so many times that the bones of the world showed through in layers of slag and adamantine. Their ridges were crowned with macro batteries, with lance nests, with void shield arrays that crackled like captive storms. Their valleys were not valleys, but trenches on a continental scale, where slave cities sprawled in the shadow of the forged citadels. Millions upon millions of wretches, packed into hab warrens, built beneath the downward gaze of gun emplacements, large enough to shell moons. Chain lines crossed the abyssal depths between one crag and the next, each link thicker than a battle tank, and from those links hung cages, platforms, gantries, and the stripped carcasses of failed captains whose bones had long since gone black beneath the furnace rain. Everywhere there was industry, industry without mercy, industry fed by flesh. The manufactoria did not merely roar, they howled. Iron presses the height of hab blocks, hammered without pause. Smelter mouths vomited sparks and liquid metal into channels cut through the rock. Rail convoys dragged endless wagon lines loaded with shell casings, corpse meal, promethium drums, chain shot, armor plates, and the disassembled limbs of demon engines bound in hexagrammatic manacles thick as a man's torso. Conveyor shrines bore the half-made and the ruined alike towards sorting pits, where blind servitors judged each thing by weight and utility alone. In the outer yards, labor gangs bent under the burden of shells, too large for any human crew to move, their backs breaking one by one, while overseers in hazard plate beat the laggards apart with shock mauls and iron staves. Above it all, towers rose. They rose from the mountain roots and the gun lines and the bastioned keeps, climbing into the poisoned sky in serried masses like a forest of spears. Some were smooth and black as void glass. Some were ribbed with external stairways and chains. Some bristled with sensor arrays and shrine cannon. Some were cathedrals to artillery, their sanctums built around breech-loading guns of such size that each firing cycle shook districts into ruin. Their bells were made from tank hulls. Their sensors burned rendered fat and machine oil. Their choirs were vox arrays that spat targeting solutions in Binharic shrieks. Medangard was a world built not for life, nor even for dominion. It had been made for war without term, siege without respite, and conquest without limit. Warsmith Damek Vor crossed one of the inner causeways of the fortress palace and looked down upon execution pits that sank into the bedrock like wounds. He did not slow. He did not need to. His helm fed him every detail in the cold green wash of tactical runes, the depth of the pits, the thermal output of the rendering fires below, the tally of bodies flensed, dismembered, or reduced to ash, the density of the gathered carrion vapors, useful data, all of it. Medangard rewarded attention to utility and punished all other habits. Rows of mutilated serfs lined the walls. Ahead of him, chained upright with their mouths wired open. They had once served in the logistics courts, if the remnants of their branded aprons spoke true. Their hands had been removed at the wrist. Their eyes had been cored out. Cables ran from the sockets in their skulls into slate-black cogitator banks built into the stone behind them. They twitched as data streamed through their flayed nervous systems. Living relays. A poor innovation, Damek thought. Crude. Wasteful in the long term, but effective enough for the interim. That alone preserved the architect from dismemberment. At the next gate stood iron warriors in full warplate, immobile as statues, bolters mag locked against their cuirasses. Their armor was scored and pitted by old campaigns. Their pauldrons bore the hazard striping of the legion dulled beneath soot and the residue of old blood. They did not salute as Damek approached. They stepped aside because his authority required it, and because the summons that had dragged him from the orbital yards had been sealed by sigils none but a fool would question. Beyond them, dormant demon engines crouched in alcoves like predatory beasts chained in sleep. Defilers with their limbs folded under them in unnatural angles. Brass scorpions with furnace eyes gone dark. Siege automata plated in scorched iron and daubed with wards that crawled when not looked at directly. From beneath their armor housings came the low throb of imprisoned spite. The machines dreamed of violence. Damek could smell it in the heat haze around them, mingled with the stink of sacrificial blood and ozone. His retinue halted at the third adamant gate. Damek entered alone. Such was the command. The inner bastions of the fortress palace were quieter than the outer works, not silent. Medangard did not know silence, but quieter in the manner of a gun deck before the firing order. The sounds were heavier there, deeper, more deliberate. The pulse of cyclopean engines came through, the floors in slow tectonic beats. Somewhere in the rock beneath his boots, something screamed for a very long time, and then ceased as abruptly as a severed cable. He passed another pit. This one was full not of slaves, but of auxiliaries in shredded combat gear, thousands of them layered into a clotting mound of broken limbs, burst torsos, and smashed skulls. Many still wore collars branded with the numerals of tithe cohorts from worlds he did not recognize. Failed levies, failed assault waves, failed offerings from some subordinate who had imagined that inadequate tribute could be hidden beneath the immensity of Medangard's needs. A lesson, then. Damek bared his teeth inside his helm. On Medangard, all things were lessons. The Strategium gates opened soundlessly. He entered a chamber vast enough to contain a city square. The ceiling arched away into darkness, ribbed with iron beams and weapon conduits. Hollow projectors cast entire systems into the air in shifting ghostlight. Star maps swam over one another. Fleet route calculations bled into munition ledgers, kill percentages, manpower attrition curves, ore extraction projections, shell expenditure forecasts, trench advanced geometries, void transit estimates, atmospheric burn rates and target saturation models rotated in silent ranks around a central dais shaped like the cut face of a bastion wall. It was less a war room than the exposed interior of a predatory mind. Upon the dais stood Perturabo. He was not enthroned. He had no need of it. The chamber itself bowed around him. He stood in colossal armor wrought like a fortress incarnate, every slab and ridge of it severe, functional, pitiless. Its surface was a darkness deeper than the iron around him, edged in cold metallic gleam where the hololithic stars broke across it. Cables fed into its back and shoulders like siege hawsers. Weapon housings bulked one gauntlet and one shoulder in brutal geometry. The air around him shimmered with restrained energies. He was immense, but it was not size alone that struck Damek. It was density, presence. The impression that the thing upon the dais was not a warrior, but a citadel that had chosen to move. His face was a hard-carved ruin above the gorget, pallid in the strategic light, eyes fixed not upon those assembled before him, but upon the war calculations turning in the air. He studied them with total calm. No bellowing, no frothing ecstasy, no theatrical displays of mutation. He watched the stars as though watching masonry laid to a plan only he could perceive in full. Warsmiths, warpsmiths, fleet tyrants and siege magi stood in a half-circle below him. None spoke. At the edge of the dais, warpsmith Caudal Hex inclined his horned helm toward Damek in acknowledgement. Mechadendrites coiled and flexed around the warpsmith's shoulders like nests of metal serpents. Lenses glowed in the recesses of his mask. A furnace grate built into his chestplate vented pale smoke with every breath. Perturabo did not turn. Damek Vor, late by 113 heartbeats. Damek dropped to one knee. "The fault is mine, Lord." "No." Perturabo's voice was deep, metallic at the edges, stripped of all wasted cadence. "The fault is in the routing of the bastion courts between the orbital yards and this chamber. It will be corrected. Your delay remains unacceptable." Damek lowered his head further. "It will not recur." "It will not," said Perturabo. The hollow display shifted. A knot of worlds sharpened into clarity near the ragged wound of the Great Rift and the broken approaches of the Cadian Gate. Defensive networks burned in red, transit lanes in white, resource density in amber. At the center of the display, a fortress world rotated, covered in bastion crowns and orbital defense rings. "Kelladac," Perturabo said. "Outer bastion world. Gate threshold. Manufactorum rich. Garrison dense. Defensive pattern orthodox. Predictable. It will become the first stone of the infinite Citadel." No one answered at once. The declaration hung in the Strategium like a blade. Caudal Hex stepped forward. "Its crustal composition is favorable for continental walling. Its orbital mechanics permit geostationary bastion anchorage. Its forge districts can be inverted for our use within acceptable loss parameters. Its population yield is sufficient for trench labor, fuel reclamation, ammunition bearing, blood tithe, and sacrificial architecture. Additional imports will still be required." Perturabo made a minute gesture. The display expanded. Supply rivers appeared in ghostlight, crossing the void from raided systems, slave stockpiles, prison hulks, demon forge musters, and fleet anchorage zones. The scale of it dwarfed any single campaign Damek had prosecuted in the last 5 centuries. "Legionaries," Caudal Hex continued, "will spear the reductions. Demon engines will break fixed lines. Siege hulks will establish orbital denial. Macro drills will pierce subcrustal redoubts. Bastion modules will be dropped in sequence to form the first ring. We will require billions of expendable bodies for trench saturation, mine clearing, void shield depletion, and munitions displacement. Engines have already been prepared to infect the manufactoria. Their own industry will grind against them before the third phase is complete." A harsh laugh rasped from the left of the chamber. Warsmith Ulrach Bren, master of the thrice cauterized, broad and scarred even by Legion standards, stepped forward with his helm mag locked to his hip. "A grand design, Lord, but my tithe fleets have been delayed by warp interference and resistance in the Serac's reach. I can deliver armor and guns. The body stock is below the requested measure." Every gaze in the Strategium shifted. Perturabo looked at him then. Damek had seen battle companies die beneath concentrated lance fire. He had watched titans torn open, from groin to reactor spine. He had stood in the blast wake of cyclonic bombardment. Nothing in those experiences matched the cold that entered the chamber when the Lord of Iron fixed his eyes upon Ulrach Bren. "Below," said Perturabo. Ulrach straightened. "Within recoverable margins." "State the deficiency." A pause. A fatal one. 9 million. The Primarch descended from the dais. He did not hurry. He walked as a fortress wall might walk if some malign intelligence had awakened in the stone. Each step rang through the Strategium floor. Ulrach Bren held his ground. To flee would have been absurd. To beg would have been worse. 9 million labor bodies, Perturabo said, stopping before him. 9 million mine clearers, 9 million shield drainers, 9 million trench fillers, 9 million shell carriers, 9 million deaths withheld from the accounting. Ulrach began. Lord, I judged that armor tonnage and shell reserve would compensate for the... Perturabo's gauntlet closed around the warsmith's throat and lifted him clear off the floor. There was no roar of effort, no flourish, only the grinding shriek of ceramite collapsing under impossible force. Ulrach's hands clawed at the Primarch's wrist. His boots kicked once in the air. Perturabo tightened his grip. The gorget caved inward. Vertebrae snapped in a wet chain. Blood jetted from the seams of the warsmith's neck seal and ran over Perturabo's knuckles in black arterial sheets. Compensation, said the Primarch, is the language of failure. He slammed Ulrach down across the edge of a data plinth. The impact broke the traitor Astartes in the middle. Armor burst apart. Bone punched through the backplate. A sound like split masonry came from the body. Then Perturabo seized the sundered torso by one ruined pauldron and dragged it, leaking and twitching, across the stone toward the open maw of a forge engine set into the chamber wall. The machine's furnace doors irised open. White light blasted out, hot enough to char the blood in the air to vapor. Within, gears the size of bastion gates turned in a rain of sparks. Perturabo fed the still convulsing remains into it one-handed. The engine bit down. There was a crunch of ceramite, the bursting pop of pressure-cooked organs, and a spray of vaporized blood that painted the nearby floor in a dark mist. Ulrach's severed lower half twitched on the stone for several heartbeats more before one of the attending servitors dragged it away by the ankle. Perturabo turned back to the assembled commanders as if nothing of significance had occurred. Weakness, he said, is not a flaw to be corrected later. It is treason committed against outcome. No one spoke. His gaze found Damek. You will command the Western Reduction Wing upon planetfall. Your objectives will be assigned by sequence. You will not pursue glory actions. You will not deviate for reputation gain. You will not mistake local victory for strategic value. If a fortress falls too early and exposes the next line before the kill lattice is prepared, you will have failed. If you win a breach that cannot be held, you will have failed. If you preserve your strength at the cost of schedule, you will have failed. Damek bowed his head. State the required outcome, Lord. The world must not merely be taken, Perturabo said. It must be converted. Its walls must forget their makers. Its roads, void ports, trenches, magazines and manufactoria must be taught a new logic. By the end of the campaign, Kelladac must no longer resemble an imperial fortress world in any useful respect. It must become one more stone in my hand. Caudal Hex emitted a binharic burst of satisfaction from his grill. The conversion engines are prepared. The orbital bastions await docking sequence. The slave brands are sanctified. The artillery moons stand loaded. Only departure remains. Perturabo turned back to the star map. Then depart. The command rippled outward through the Strategium and into the fortress palace, into the docking caverns and fleet pits, into Vox towers and pit shrines and slave compounds and macro shell magazines. Sirens began to moan across Medangard. Massive and sonorous, they sounded less like alarms than the opening notes of a dirge for worlds not yet dead. Damek rose and withdrew, his mind already partitioning the campaign into consumptions and necessities. As he passed back through the inner gates, Medangard was awakening to war on a greater scale still. Fleet recalls pulsed from the tower crowns in coded bursts. In the lower yards, cult armies were driven into assembly canyons and branded by the thousand, their flesh smoking where iron sigils bit deep. Demon engines were hauled in chains toward transport cradles by teams of slave ogrins and crawler rigs. Macro drills the length of hive spires were winched onto void lifters. Orbital bastion components, each a mountain of armor and gun housings, rumbled along magnetized rails toward launch catapults. Endless columns of labor stock marched through the fortress yards, disappearing into the holds of black belly barges under the lash and the crack of execution shots. Above all of it, the black sun watched. Damek reached the outer battlements in time to see the first of the warfleet rise from the cradles of Medangard. Battleships plated in soot-dark iron, grand cruisers hung with chains and bombardment arrays, siege hulks swollen with guns and slave pens, armor transports, macro shell tenders, fuel arcs, machine haulers, prison barges, and the coffin-shaped drop vessels of the Legion. They climbed through the poisoned clouds in disciplined silence, while batteries from the mountain cathedrals fired honor salvos into the heavens, each discharge stamping a ring of fire across the cloud deck. This was no raid, no punitive sack, no butcher's errand against some doomed border world. The scale of the departure crushed such thoughts into irrelevance. Medangard was not casting out a warband. It was extending a hand made of fleets and engines, and billions of disposable lives toward the Imperium's throat. Damek Vor stood beneath the dead light of the black sun, and watched the armada translate into the void, and for the first time in many centuries, he felt something close to awe. Not reverence, never that. Perturabo inspired no love. But the shape of the undertaking revealed itself to him then, in all its monstrous purity. A world would die, then another after that. Each one flensed to bedrock, fortified anew, chained into the next. A siege not of a city or a planet, but of an empire. A wall built from the ruins of conquered stars, advancing one atrocity at a time. Kelladac would be the first stone only. The map of the Imperium would bleed. Its edges would harden into iron. And at the center of that slow strangulation would stand the Lord of Iron, patient as artillery, cold as void metal, measuring the death of worlds by tonnage, geometry, and time. Kelladac had been raised for war long before the first warning reached its command sanctums. It had been born in war, fed on war, sanctified by war, and all that lived upon its ashen skin had been measured against the needs of war alone. The world turned beneath a pale and dusty star, its continents scored by trench labyrinths, visible even from orbit, its mountain chains bored through and plated over with fortress crowns, its hive masses girdled with ring walls and interlocking bastions so vast that each district seemed a kingdom of guns unto itself. Nothing of Kelladac had been left to chance or grace. The plains had been flattened for fire lanes and armor maneuver. The valleys had been drowned in ferrocrete and adamant revetments. The poleward reaches were sheathed in munitions vaults, promethium cistern fields and reserve depots guarded by void, shield arrays that rose from the ground like the ribs of buried giants. From the Western Hemisphere to the equatorial gunbelts, armored rail lines ran in black iron bands, carrying shells the size of hab blocks, battle tanks in endless files, and replacement cohorts for the line regiments, whose losses were counted not by company or brigade, but by the million. Forge districts belched smoke over entire nations. Their foundries never slept. Labor serfs hauled ore, shell casings, weapon parts and food allotments beneath the eyes of overseers and the Auspex lamps of machine sentinels. Skitari cohorts drilled in lockstep between manufactoria walls, scorched black by decades of overpressure venting. Fortress guns stood over the world like cathedrals, whose creed was annihilation, their sanctums plated in bronze and iron, their gun crews ritually anointed before every loading cycle by priests who smelled of incense, sacred oil, and chemash. Billions defended Kelladac. Billions worked for its defense. Billions would die for it if commanded. Such was the purpose of a bastion world. Yet when the first astropath died, he did not die with dignity. He burst. The soul-bound wretch had been shrieking in the choir vault for almost an hour, clawing blood from his own face, as the choir master and sanctioned attendants tried to cage the transmission into coherent bursts for relay to high command. The message never resolved. His eyes boiled in their sockets. His tongue split down the middle. Flesh ruptured along his throat and breastbone in wet red seams, and the warning came out in a froth of blood and fragmented words. Iron. Wall. The Lord walks. Worlds chained. Then his ribcage broke outward, and something black and steaming spilled across the sanctified tiles. The attending adepts began to pray. 2 more astropaths collapsed in seizure before the first had finished twitching. By the 3rd death, the warning had already climbed the command hierarchy in pieces. Lord. General Castor Vale received it within the inner strategy hall of Bastion Primus, where the walls were lined with campaign banners, shell tallies, and votive plaques hammered from the armor of dead tanks. He was a lean man, made hard by long service and longer attrition, his grey hair shorn close to the skull, his face lined with the strain of command rather than vanity. He stood before a relief projection of the world, with his hands braced behind his back, while staff officers muttered over casualty reserve tables and redeployment timetables. His expression did not alter at the report. Only the tendons in his jaw drew taut. Across the chamber, Marshal Othmar Kessel of the Black Templars stood in sable plate beneath the hanging banners of his crusade, helm under one arm, the other resting upon the pommel of a chained sword whose teeth were flecked with old burns. He was tall even by the measure of the Adeptus Astartes, his face gaunt and severe, his scalp shaven, his eyes dark and pitiless beneath a brow cut by old blade scars. He had the look of a man who considered death a tool and martyrdom a form of obedience. Near the Strategium dais stood Magos Dominus Acast Rho-71, a towering engine of red robes, blackened mechadendrites, and bronze-plated skeletal limbs. What remained of his human head was buried in sensor housings and vox grills, lenses irised within a skull mask of polished iron. Sacred data strips hung from his shoulders in rustling sheaves. Every motion of his body came with the hiss of pistons and the low harmonic thrum of internal reactors. The choirmaster's report ended. Silence followed. Castor Vale broke it first. I will not have panic spread by half-formed visions and the death convulsions of psychers. Augur stations confirm a mass in the outer dark, nothing more. Kelladac has endured raids, splinter crusades, void sieges, orc infestations, and tyrannid splinter strikes. It will endure this. We maintain formation, discipline, reserve depth, and fire rationing until we know the exact composition of the threat. Marshal Kessel's lip curled. You speak as though endurance were victory, General. The foe gathering in the void is not a raider pack seeking plunder. I have seen the outer vox traffic. I have read the astropathic fragments. This stinks of the arch-enemy. There will be no preserving of strength for some later, more convenient hour. If traitor sons come, they must be met with oath and blade. Vale turned to him. And if I hurl my reserves into empty darkness because your zeal finds patience distasteful, what then? You will commend my courage over the corpses of the gun crews left unrelieved when the true assault begins. I will commend nothing, Kessel said. I will kill. That is why my crusade remains. Metallic clicks issued from Akast Rose grill as Binharic notation streamed through hidden processors. When he spoke, his voice emerged layered with vox harmonics and machine static. Secondary concern exceeds emotional dispute threshold. All forge complexes of strategic grade must be sanctified for denial. Should enemy acquisition probability rise above tolerable limits, plasma induction overloads will be initiated. Better to destroy productive capacity than permit inversion by hostile actors. Castor Vale frowned. You would gut the world's forges before the enemy even makes orbit. I would preserve doctrinal purity of machine function, the Magos replied. Contamination by traitor techno-heresy is not acceptable. Productive annihilation is preferable to blasphemous reutilization. Kessel gave a curt nod. On this, machine priest, you speak with sense. Vale exhaled once through his nose. You both hunger for final acts before the first shell has been loaded. No, not yet. We hold, we assess, we preserve the guns, the rail arteries and the labor schedules. I will not scuttle our own spine because a choir died, choking on dread. Another officer hurried into the hall, pale beneath the ash dust on his uniform. He saluted with visible effort. My Lord General, 2 augur priest stations on the outer moon line have gone dark. No distress codes, just silence. Before Vale could answer, all the projection displays in the Strategium flickered. The outer system bloomed in red. What had been a haze at the edge of detection resolved into mass and iron beyond sane proportion. Ships by the thousands. Not a fleet in elegant battle array, but a siege migration. Battle barges like mobile fortresses, their hulls layered in plating so thick they seemed cut from asteroids rather than forged. Macro haulers swollen with cargo, holds vast enough for armies. Slave arcs crammed into one another like plague cysts. Armor hulks with entire tank parks bolted to their flanks. Asteroid forts wrapped in gun decks and void shield veins. Demon engine transports bound in chains of runic metal. Scrap vessels welded. From the ruins of older wars and driven ahead in dense sacrificial waves, their profiles crude, ugly, and somehow more appalling for that very lack of elegance. Kelladac's nearest outer picket station transmitted a burst before its signal died in white static. The final image was a wall of iron spreading across the stars. Castor Vale stared at the feed and felt, deep beneath discipline, the first true weight of what had come for them. In orbit above the flagship bastion of the Iron Warriors, warsmith Damek Vor watched the same world through a different geometry. Kelladac turned beneath him in targeting grids, its ring forts and bastion crowns picked out in range calculations and munitions priority bands. Every defense laser, every orbital mirror, every moon battery and void station was already named in sequence within the tactical cogitators. He had prosecuted sieges on 100 worlds. He knew the hunger that came before the first descent, the urge to strike fast, crack the sky wide, and hammer a breach before the defenders could find equilibrium. Perturabo forbade it. The Lord of Iron stood at the center of the command deck, while range solutions spiraled around him in green and blood-red light. His expression was that of a sculptor considering stone that required patient breaking. No planetfall, he said. Damek kept his irritation behind the mask of obedience. Their upper moons remain active. Their outer bastions are prepared for layered defense. A rapid descent beneath the envelope could seize ground before the guns are fully ranged. Perturabo did not even glance at him. Ground seized under hostile orbital dominance is ground offered for execution. You will wait. Caudal Hex's mechadendrites twitched over the hololith. Outer moons designated for sequential excision. Orbital mirrors will be blinded. Defense satellites stripped. Void bastions punctured and rendered into impact debris. Ammunition drain protocols already underway. Damek looked to the forward screens and understood the method with renewed contempt and unwilling admiration. The first ships committed were not Legion hulls. They were hollowed bulk haulers, prison hulks, scrap barges, and overpacked slave carriers, driven ahead in broad, clotted masses toward Kelladac's firing line. Their engines burned hot and dirty. No void shields protected them. Their hulls were painted with crude root sigils and lash brands visible even across the dark. Packed within their holds were pressed human multitudes taken from the tithe pits of 100 dead worlds, expendable not merely in the strategic sense, but in the arithmetic of the opening salvos. Kelladac's outer batteries fired as doctrine demanded. Lances speared out. Macro shells crossed the void in incandescent storms. Hulls burst open in chains of white fire. Tens of thousands died in the first minute, then tens of thousands more. But each explosion marked a gun line. Each shattered. Barge revealed a range solution. Each lance trace exposed a battery nest, an orbital station, a moon bastion, or a concealed mirror array. Perturabo began the reduction, as a surgeon begins dismemberment, not with rage, but with precision. Coordinates flickered. Iron Warrior's ships answered in controlled sequence. A defense satellite vanished in a sphere of ruptured metal. Then another. A moon battery took 3 direct macro impacts and split across its equator, atmosphere and machine debris, venting into the void in a glittering corpse cloud. Orbital mirrors shattered one by one beneath lance strikes so exact that their reflected beams fired into nothing but darkness and ruin. Bastion stations died under sustained bombardment, their armor hammered flat before torpedoes punched through and detonated their reactor hearts. Kelladac fired and fired and fired, yet each shot diminished it. Then, amid the cold butchery of attrition, fury answered from the world below. A Black Templar's strike cruiser broke from behind the thermal shadow of a crippled defense platform and drove straight into the flank of one of the advancing Iron Warrior's assault hulks. Boarding torpedoes followed in a storm of burning icons. Vox channels erupted with impact reports. Daemon bared his teeth. On the hulk's interior feeds, blast doors buckled inward. Smoke poured through chapels of iron and chain. Then the Sons of Dawn came howling through the breaches, black plate bright with oath parchment, tabards blackened by heat, chain blades screaming in the red dark. They did not fight as defenders trying to buy time. They fought as executioners seeking a death worthy of witness. "By the throne and the blood of Sigismund," one roared, as he tore an Iron Warrior's head from his shoulders with a two-handed sweep of his relic blade. "No traitor shall find harbor in this void." Bolter fire flashed in corridor chokes. Ceramite shattered. A Templar sword brother drove his blade through the eye lens of a traitor legionary and stamped the body down while his brothers surged over it into the gun decks. Another hurled himself into the firing pit of a siege cannon and hacked apart the loading servitors with such ferocity that their limbs drummed wetly against the deck plating. They died in scores. They killed in scores. For a brief and savage span, the hulk became a shrine of butchery where black-armored loyalists and iron-clad traitors hacked one another to pieces, knee-deep in blood and machine oil. Daemon took a step toward the embarkation rail. "Permit counterboarding. I will cleanse the hulk myself." Perturabo raised one hand. "No. Their strike is localized. A decisive response would..." "It would satisfy your temper," Perturabo said. "Nothing more. The hulk is already written off in acceptable margins. Their victory there will draw them farther from the main orbital lattice. Let them spend themselves in a dead carcass." Daemon said. Nothing. To be denied in the face of visible insult galled him more than loss itself, but the Primarch was right in the coldest sense. Even the Black Templar's ferocity had been accounted for. Their attack tore open one hulk, gutted compartments, slew traitor crews, and brought Kelladac a moment of savage exultation. Then Iron Warrior's batteries sheared the hulk from the wider formation, isolated it, and let it drift burning amid the wreck fields, while the main reduction continued without pause. By the time the last Templar beacon winked out inside the dying vessel, Kelladac's outer moons were broken, and its defense satellites had become a ring of molten debris. Hours passed in calculated annihilation. Daemon watched bastion after bastion lose cohesion under the steady, unornamented genius of Perturabo's siege mind. No wild thrusts, no vainglorious spearhead. The Primarch reduced the system layer by layer, forcing the defenders to answer where he wished them to answer, draining magazines, uncovering hidden assets, teaching the void around Kelladac to betray its own masters. Then came the first orbital fortress. It emerged from the rear mass of the Iron Warrior's armada, towed by linked macro haulers, and driven by engine wakes bright enough to stain the auger screens. It was not a ship in the common sense. It was a bastion torn from the idea of a fortress and taught to fly. Gun decks layered its sides in terraces. Void shield projectors rose from it like tower keeps. Docking moors yawned across its armored face. Thruster spines burned beneath its bulk as it advanced through wreckage and fire toward geostationary alignment over Kelladac's equatorial belt. The defenders understood too late. Every surviving gun on the world opened upon it. Macro shells burst against overlapping shields. Lances scarred its armor. The fortress kept coming. Iron Warrior's capital ships screened its flanks, taking punishment with the indifference of anvils. Slave barges and wrecked hulks were driven ahead of it as burning ablative mass. Bit by bit, kilometer by kilometer, the monstrous structure crawled into position over the world. Kelladac had not merely failed to repulse the invader, it had allowed the invader to begin construction. When the fortress locked into geostationary station, great anchorage spires unfolded from its underside and stabbed beams of targeting light down through the atmosphere. Secondary modules burned in its wake. More bastions would come. The ring had begun. Within Bastion Primus, sirens moaned through the command halls. Lord General Vale looked up at the projection and knew with absolute clarity that the enemy did not mean to raid, break, plunder, and depart. They meant to stay until the world had been rewritten. Across every Vox channel in the system, overriding command frequencies, distress lines, prayer bands, Mechanicus code streams, and military nets alike, a single voice spoke. It was deep, metallic, utterly without haste, and every syllable carried the weight of iron falling. This is Perturabo, Lord of Iron, Primarch of the Fourth. Kelladac is measured and found suitable. You will surrender all batteries, all void assets, all manufactoria, and all command authorities. You will disarm. You will submit to remaking. Refusal will not preserve you. It will only alter the order of your extinction. This world will be broken to bedrock and rebuilt as one more wall in my march to terror. The transmission ended. For a long moment, no one on Kelladac spoke. Then, all across the Bastion world, guns began to load. Kelladac's skies ceased to belong to Kelladac before the first landing engines touched ground. The world had endured bombardment through the long black hours after Perturabo's proclamation, but bombardment was still a familiar language. Kelladac understood shells. It understood lance impact and pressure wave, crater lip and secondary fire, void loss and casualty replacement. Its commanders had charts for all those things. Its priests had litanies for them. Its labor castes had burial quotas and corpse recovery schedules measured against projected attrition. What came next belonged to another order of war entirely. The heavens opened in iron. Drop pods screamed through the cloud decks by the thousand, each one a burning nail hurled from orbit into a world already convulsing beneath bombardment. Tunneling drills descended on thruster spines and impact boosters, giant teeth shrieking as they bit into bastion earthworks and bedrock alike. Armored landers came down in dense assault waves, their ramps already vomiting smoke and muzzle flash before their hulls had fully settled into the ash. Slave barges, obscene and bloated, staggered through anti-aircraft fire, trailing corpses and torn plating, only to split open across the plains and disgorge human multitudes in such numbers that the first ranks were trampled flat by those behind them before they had taken 10 steps. Siege towers rode down from the dark on gravitic shackles and retrojets, immense mobile bastions plated in black iron and bristling with gun mouths, descending into infernos of flak and exploding shells as if the world beneath them had already been measured and condemned. They landed across whole continents at once. The western trench shelf burned. The ringed fortress belts of the equatorial gun line vanished under impact blossoms. Armor reserves rushing toward the northern rail junctions found the junctions already pounded into slag by descending macro fire. In the ash deserts between hive bastions, entire regimental musters disappeared beneath the falling wreckage of shattered orbital debris, torn apart by metal still hot from re-entry. The sky glowed red and brass and corpse white. Shattered satellites and void station fragments came down like judgment. Gunships died in the air and rained wreckage over refugee columns already penned into denial zones by their own commanders. Vox traffic dissolved into screams, prayer code, range correction, and the endless repetition of landing coordinates now rendered meaningless by the sheer number of invasions already underway. The Iron Warriors made ground, and then they made it impossible to reclaim. That was the first true lesson of the Planetary War, where another legion might have sought a rapid decapitation strike, where berserkers would have flooded forward in a froth of blades and black joy. The sons of Perturabo did what they had been made to do in the furnace of the Great Crusade, and perfected in 10,000 years of hatred. They dug, they measured, they emplaced. They took every meter gained from fire and blood and turned it at once into a new problem for the defender. Even as shells burst among them, Iron Warriors, combat engineers, and chained labor mobs clawed firing trenches into the ground in mathematically exact intervals. Siege augers thudded into crater fields and returned data that became kill zones before the smoke had cleared. Heavy weapons were dragged into position under barrage and locked into arcs so precise that entire avenues of approach became invisible graves the moment a track or boot crossed them. Minefields appeared where moments before there had only been blasted mud. Redoubts rose from prefabricated bastion segments hammered together by servo rigs and slave hands slick with blood. Razor wire unfurled in black coils over corpse banks. Anti-armor ditches were cut in interlocking lines that herded Imperial counterattacks toward unseen gun nests and pre-ranged artillery pockets. It was not advance, it was infection. Kelladac bled iron geometry into itself. The first waves of expendable human bodies made the shape of that geometry plain. The slave legions were driven ahead under lash, bolt round and electroprod, rank upon rank of branded men packed so tightly that the dead remained standing for several paces after their hearts had burst. They went into wire first, their bodies torn open on the barbs while the ranks behind climbed over them. They went into mine belts and announced each buried charge with red spray and flung bone. They went into flame corridors where promethium jets turned them into running torches whose shrieking lit the trench fog. They went into the heavy bolter lanes of Kelladac's wall guns until the ground became unrecognizable, a steaming mass of churned mud and split organs and shredded uniforms so deep that the next assault waves crossed anti-personnel ditches on rafts of the dead. Imperial gunners did their duty. Their guns spoke until their barrels glowed. But the slave legions did what they had been sent to do. They revealed the fire patterns. They showed where the wall guns had dead ground. They choked the outer moats with enough ruined flesh to make crossing possible. They collapsed trench revetments under sheer weight of corpse and panic. They fed the arithmetic. At Bastion Primus, Lord General, Castavale stood over fresh projections, while staff officers barked revised grid references and casualty estimates that ceased to mean anything human after the first hour. He had abandoned the hope of preserving the full outer belts. Now he fought for sequence, timing, and order. "Do not break cohesion to answer every false breach," he said, voice hoarse from recycled air and unending command. "They want our reserves moving blind. Hold the inner armor until they commit engines. Umbrella barrages over the western shelf. Staggered withdrawal on the southern ring forts. If a line must give, it gives in blocks, not in panic." A colonel of the fortress artillery, face grey with dust and sleeplessness, saluted sharply. "My lord, the labor wards are dark. Civilian sectors 12 through 19 have lost all power." "They remain dark," Vale replied without looking at him. "Redirect every available charge to the fortress grids." There was the smallest pause before the colonel answered, "Those sectors hold millions." Vale's eyes did not leave the world map. "Then millions will learn that Kelladac survives by gunfire, not comfort." In the forge sanctums beneath the bastions, Magos Dominus Acast Row, -71 had already gone further. Entire HAB districts were blacked out to keep macro batteries charged. Nutrient pumps failed in worker warrens, so defense shields might hold another few minutes under bombardment. Civilian air scrubber networks slowed until children and laborers choked in the dark, while the Forge districts screamed on at full overclock. The Magos did not consider it cruelty. Cruelty implied sentiment. This was function. Power redirection exceeds acceptable organic survival parameters, one subordinate intoned in Binharic. Organic survival parameters are non-primary, Acast replied. Fortress preservation remains doctrinal. Famine projections rise. Then starvation will serve where discipline is insufficient. Yet even as Kelladac strangled its own people to keep its guns alive, Caudal Hex began to rot those guns from within. The Warpsmith established his first siege shrines in the crater shadows behind the landing grounds. Iron altars hammered into the ash, while chained adepts poured sacred unguents made from machine oil, blood, and rendered nerve tissue across vox arrays, captured intact from the outer redoubts. Mechadendrites plunged into severed command cables. Bound demon sparks howled inside copper cages. The rites he spoke were not prayers as the Imperium knew prayer. They were violations articulated in Binharic corrosion and warp-charged command phrases that made Auspec's needles tremble and machine spirits scream in mute protest. Across Kelladac, systems began to falter at the worst possible moment. Defense augers returned false ranges just as artillery trains moved into position. Magazine safeties failed and munitions cooked off inside loading bays, blowing gun crews into strips of meat and hot metal. Manufactoria tasked with turning out battle tank motive assemblies began producing flawed components whose tolerances were wrong by fractions too small for human oversight, yet large enough to cripple tracks and lock turrets under stress. Shell casings split. Targeting spirits sulked and refused communion. Armor reserve columns rolled from the forge depots, only for drive systems to seize in the field, leaving tanks stranded as pillboxes for enemy guns. Acast Rowe recognized the taint almost at once. Machine heresy vector confirmed. He rasped over secure command channels. Quarantine all secondary fab lines. Destroy compromised cogitator cores. Purge with sanctified fire. The answer came back from 3 sectors at once. They had tried. The fires spread wrongly. The cogitators did not die cleanly. Systems spoke to one another after severance. The corruption moved like a prayer written in rust. Then the armored counterstrikes began. Castervale launched them not from anger, but from necessity. Whole spearheads of battle tanks and super heavies ground out from hidden reserve galleries beneath the inner bastions, tracks crushing rubble and half-buried corpses as they formed into assault wedges beneath umbrella barrages of covering fire. Artillery from 3 fortress belts fired in layered curtains overhead, shell after shell after shell, passing low enough to shake the paint from tank hulls as the armored columns drove into the Iron Warriors' forward works. The ground vanished behind them in fountains of earth and screaming metal. For a brief and terrible interval, Kelladac struck back as it had been built to strike. The first Iron Warriors' trench line vanished under that counterblow. Slave bodies and traitor dead flew apart in red tatters. Redoubts collapsed. Siege guns toppled and vanished in dust. Armored fists smashed through assault lanes the enemy had only begun to consolidate. And then the second trap closed. The first line had never been intended to hold. As the Imperial columns surged into the breach, pre-surveyed range markers woke across the ash. Mine belts detonated in echelon. Concealed macro cannon hidden beneath camo netting and corpse heaps fired into the flanks of the advancing tanks. Anti-armor guns rose from revetments the counterstrike had mistaken for burial mounds. The ground beneath the lead super heavies gave way where tunneling charges had honeycombed it, and entire engines sank nose first into pits lined with melter charges that went off a heartbeat later. Artillery from Iron Warriors' rear batteries walked forward in perfect intervals, bracket by bracket, until the advancing armor was caught in a cage of fire with no room left to maneuver. Withdraw in discipline, Vale ordered the moment he understood. No rout. Pull back by cohort and line. Mark all crippled engines for demolition. But even that measured order found enemies, waiting for it. The retreat routes had been ranged long before the tanks began to reverse. Shells fell on ammunition reserves only moments after they were moved. Fuel columns detonated in bright orange chains, as if some invisible eye had followed them through the dust. Reserve infantry pushed toward the fighting arrived, to find their assembly grounds already cratered, and their officers dead beneath precision strikes. It was as though the enemy had anticipated not merely action, but decision. In the western breach districts, Marshal Othmar Kessel answered not with measured attrition, but with wrath. He had watched the outer trench lines drown in blood. He had seen the enemy turn the dead into causeways and cover. That could not stand in the sight of the Emperor. The Black Templars went forward on foot, where the ground was too ruin-choked for clean armor advance. They took the breach lines personally, as Kessel had sworn they would. Black plate vanished into smoke and emerged amid the enemy works with chain blades revving and relic bolters barking. Their war cries rolled over the trenches like cathedral bells broken into rage. No step yielded to traitors. By Dawn's blood and Sigismund's wrath, purge them to the root. They charged into trenches already clogged with bodies and half-buried armor wrecks, boots sinking ankle-deep into blood thick as sump oil. One Templar brother planted his combat shield against the lip of a firing bay and took 3 bolter rounds square across it, while his sword brother vaulted over his shoulder to land among the iron warriors beyond, chain blades soaring through helm, collar, and clavicle in one savage descending cut. Another fired point blank into the face of a traitor gunner, then drove forward through the spray to butcher the loader and the next 2 Legion serfs with such pitiless economy it seemed execution rather than battle. The Sons of Dawn did not break easily. Perhaps they could not. For a time the trenches became a series of local hells where no side gave ground without turning it into a slaughter pen. Templars hacked down traitor marines in narrow fighting bays where no firearm could be brought to proper bear. Iron warriors answered with entrenching blades, bolter muzzles jammed into chest joints, and siege hammers swung in arcs so brutal that limbs and heads burst apart against revetments. Dismembered corpses slid underfoot. Ruptured power packs burned against heaps of bodies, cooking meat and armor alike. Men drowned face down in mud made from ash, blood, dirt, and liquefied organs. Damek Vor came to the ring fort of Galzour under this sky and made it his work. Galzour had once anchored a full section of Kelladac's western gun line, a circular fortress sunk into a plateau of black stone and ferrocrete, its walls layered in concentric defense rings, macro embrasures and trench collars that had repulsed 3 previous Xenos invasions. Its defenders believed it could hold until reinforcement. They still thought in the old logic of Kelladac. Damek intended to teach them the new. He did not simply shell the ring fort, he peeled it. Slave waves went first, dying on the outer guns until the pattern of fire was clear. Combat engineers followed behind portable shield mantlets and smoke generators, cutting approach trenches under constant bombardment until the iron warriors had crawled within breaching range. Caudal Hex's corrupted signals spat false range data into the fort's command relays. One gun tier fired too high, another misread windage, a third jammed on its own loading sequence. Then the siege drills struck the underworks, while bombardment towers walked shells across the upper parapets in exact cadence. When the breach came, Damek led it himself. He entered with his Terminator guard through a wound in the wall, still vomiting dust and severed men. He was not a poet of war. He was not some howling butcher lord drunk on murder for its own sake. He was an iron warrior. He killed the way a siege engine killed, with weight and finality. His hammer crushed a defender's breastplate inward until ribs punched through the man's back in a red spray. His combi bolter blew apart a gun crew in the loading gallery, the shells detonating among stacked munitions and ripping the bay into a cyclone of iron fragments and burning meat. One loyalist officer lunged at him with a power sword and a prayer on his lips. Damek caught the blade on his vambrace, drove forward through the sparks, and head-butted the man hard enough to burst both eyes from the sockets before finishing him with a downward strike that flattened helm, skull, and command lectern together. Around him, his legionaries proved what the defenders had begun too late to understand. The Iron Warriors were not merely bombardiers. They were close-range predators shaped by 10,000 years of trench butchery and breach fighting. Once the wall was open, they became more savage, not less. They stabbed through firing slits into faces behind them. They dragged men bodily from casemates and beat them to death against ammunition racks. They used demolition charges not only on doors, but on clusters of wounded huddled in medici niches, sealing screams and flesh together under collapsing stone. When Galzour's inner command sanctum finally fell, Damek stood over the dead command staff and looked out through the shattered viewing ports at the trenches beyond. He could see it clearly then. The world was changing shape beneath them, not merely losing ground, but being taught a different purpose. Kelladac's defense lines were being snapped and reset into new angles. Roads were being cut, not for supply, but for future fields of fire. Captured bastions were not stripped and abandoned. They were measured, reinforced, altered. Imperial geometry died. Perturabo's geometry replaced it. The defenders saw it too. Castavale saw it in the revised maps, where every line he yielded became a stronger line in enemy hands. Akast Rose saw it in the machine flows, where captured forge nodes began feeding hostile logic back across the network.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
Othmar Kessel saw it in the breach lines, where every trench retaken at the cost of Black Templars was already overlooked by some fresh redoubt built overnight from spoil, corpses, and iron plate. They were not simply being conquered, they were being converted. Toward the close of that ruinous day, the sky changed again. Warp static rolled across the vox nets in oily bursts that turned commands to shrieks and battle cant to metallic wailing. Purple lightning crawled through the ash clouds without thunder. In districts reduced to shell holes and broken habs, iron growths began forcing themselves from the ground in ugly branching masses, as if the world's bones were pushing upward through the skin. Gun barrels left cooling on parapets fused to their mounts in twisted new shapes. Tank wrecks sprouted black. Metallic spines from burst armor seams. In one captured trench, a line of dead men fused chest to back into a single iron-encrusted ridge by dawn, their skulls still visible beneath the growing metal. No one yet named the cause aloud, but in command bunker and trench line, in forge shrine and gun pit alike, the same understanding spread with the static and the blood stink. The slaughter had become sufficient. Something worse than a warsmith's cunning was descending toward Kelladac, and the world could feel it coming in its iron marrow. The storm did not gather from any quarter of the sky that mortal men could name. It rose from the killing itself. By the time the fourth cycle of planetary bombardment had ended, Kelladac had ceased to resemble a bastion world in the old imperial sense, and become something wounded, fevered, and unstable beneath the weight of its own dying. The trench continents were no longer fixed lines upon maps, but vast wounds of churned black earth, collapsing revetments, ruptured fuel canals, and corpse drifts so deep that tanks drove across the dead without once finding the original ground. Fortress belts that had stood for centuries in disciplined geometry now burned in broken arcs, some sections still firing with mechanical devotion, while adjacent sectors drowned in smoke and ruin. The forge districts howled day and night, not with productive labor now, but with the sound of malfunctioning engines, sacrificial overloads, ruptured plasma lines and machine spirits, driven to a state that the priests of Mars would have named agony had they possessed the humility to use such a human word. The veil thinned because too much blood had soaked into too much iron. Men felt it before the instruments failed. Gunners in the western macro towers began muttering to themselves as they loaded. Infantry in reserve galleries woke from combat trance with blood in their mouths, and the sense that something enormous had leaned close to listen to. Their hearts. In the medici vaults, the wounded cried out and tried to crawl from their cots, not because they understood what came, but because the flesh knew before the mind. Even the servitors spasmed against their restraining bolts. Their dull, lobotomized faces twitched, and their augmetic limbs jerked as if invisible fingers were testing them for strength. Then the Auspex arrays collapsed into nonsense. Screens that had displayed coherent range bands and hostile movement patterns for weeks vomited spirals of impossible code. Targeting displays became black storms of static, lit from within by flickers of angry red. Cogitator banks screamed warning tones until their internal safeties burned out and the chambers filled with the stink of melted wiring. Vox traffic across the capital bastion hive shuddered, broke apart, and returned as shrieking metallic reverberations. Voices stretched into machine agony. Commands turned into grinding bursts of sound, like chains dragged over rusted plate. The adept in charge of one command relay tore his own earpiece free and found half his ear came away with it in a wet red strip. The wounded machines began to move. A battle tank crippled 3 days before, in the shadow of a ring, Fort suddenly lurched on its shattered track assembly and turned its ruined turret a quarter circle toward nothing at all, gears grinding, though no motive power remained. A line of macro shells stacked in a loading cathedral rolled of their own accord across the deck and settled in a new pattern like obedient beasts. Broken gun servitors began to tremble on their mounts, their optical nodes brightening and dimming as if in fear. In one artillery sanctum, an earthshaker cannon split open along its breech with a shriek of tortured metal and bent slowly downward until the barrel touched the blood-slick floor in a posture the horrified crew would later call prostration before dying with their eyes burst. Lord General Castor Vale stood in the upper command bastion and felt warm liquid strike the back of his glove. He turned. The young signals officer behind him was staring at nothing. Thin lines of blood ran from both his eyes down his pale face. Then the officer's knees gave way. He hit the floor without a sound. Around the command chamber, others faltered, cursed, wiped blood from their noses, or blinked red tears onto tactical slates. Vale himself felt pressure bloom behind his own eyes, a heavy inward force like mailed thumbs pressing toward the softest part of the skull. No one yet said the name aloud. They did not need to. The enemy had sent more than engines and guns to Kelladac. It had sent its master. At the front of the central siege line, where the capital's outer gate bastions still held beneath a storm of shells, warsmith Damek Vor stood atop a captured redoubt and watched the sky unmake itself. He had prosecuted 3 major breach actions since the fall of Galzour. He had broken 2 ring forts and half a district of trench cathedrals. His losses had remained within acceptable margins. His emplacements were ahead of schedule in 3 sectors. He had expected, if not praise, then at least the cold acknowledgement of utility when the Primarch at last chose to descend. What came down from the storm was not spectacle. It was verdict. The cloud layer above the central front blackened as if the world had passed beneath an eclipse, yet no celestial body moved to explain it. Lightning moved through the smoke in hard, angular veins of violet and corpse-pale light. Then the darkness bulged. It did not open like a portal in a sorcerer's fable. It compressed, folded inward, and gave way beneath intolerable pressure, as if some siege weight from another realm had been forced against reality until reality cracked. Perturabo stepped through. He came down upon the blasted earth before the outer gate lines, and the ground answered with a concussion that flung dust, shell casings, and loose stone outward in a ring. Men near the impact went to their knees. Some were not struck by force at all, yet dropped screaming with both hands clamped over their helmets as blood poured from the seals around their eyes. A slave overseer 50 paces away burst the capillaries in his face and fell dead without a mark upon him. The corpse of a horse from a shattered transport cart convulsed on the ground, and then lay still, its skin splitting in long lines, as if the flesh itself had recoiled from proximity. Perturabo rose from the impact crouch in slow and terrible measure. He was vast, not merely in the way of a Primarch's height, but in the sense of mass concentrated beyond reason. He seemed wrought from density itself, every line of his armor cut for war rather than display, every edge hard, brutal, functional. He did not wear ornament in the decadent manner of other traitor lords. He wore architecture. His plate rose in slabs and bastion faces, articulated to permit motion only where war required motion. Cables fed into his gorget and spine like the hauling chains of great guns. His gauntlets were crushing instruments. His shoulders were broad enough to seem capable of bearing artillery parapets. Around him, the air shook with heat shimmer, static discharge, and the restrained menace of energies forced into discipline by a mind that permitted itself no indulgence. His face was the most terrible thing of all, because it was not that of a beast or madman. It was thinking, coldly, perfectly, with hatred so controlled it had become method. He looked once upon the gate bastions, and Damek knew with a surge of brutal certainty that the Primarch had understood the entire front in that single glance. The shell damage, the stress fractures, the hidden transit tunnels, the weak load bearing lines in the inner wall, the false reserve routes the Imperials had prepared. All of it, not as guesswork, not as instinct, as comprehension. The Imperial macro batteries fired. The order had gone out the moment the Auspex screens resolved a target large enough and singular enough to justify every gun within reach. The bastion cathedrals opened in a storm of thunder that shook the teeth in men's mouths. Shells the size of troop carriers crossed the intervening ground, trailing fire and pressure waves. They struck Perturabo's position in overlapping bursts, sufficient to erase companies. Earth became boiling vapor. Stone became knives. Black mud and shredded flesh rained upward. Successive impacts walked across the zone until the plane vanished beneath one continuous upheaval of explosive force. When the smoke broke, he was still walking. He did not sprint. He did not leap. He advanced with the deliberate mass of a siege engine crossing ground already judged beneath its weight. Shells burst against his armor and drove sparks from it like forge hammers striking plate. A near hit to his left threw out enough force to pulp men in their trenches, and still he turned his head toward a different sector, speaking into the vox, as if crossing a parade ground rather than the focal point of a macro barrage. Third battery cluster. Shift fire 6 degrees north by east. The reserve armor will commit from beneath the rail embankment within 2 minutes. Destroy the embankment now. The response came at once from the Iron Warriors' rear lines. Guns spoke. Far off, where no Imperial movement had yet been detected by Loyalist command, the embankment detonated in a chain of collapses. Seconds later, the hidden armor reserve tried to emerge through a rain of ferrocrete and fire and was buried alive in its own concealed approach. Perturabo kept walking. Advance the siege towers to marker line theta. Hold the left trench mouth. There is a secondary ammunition magazine beneath the Basilica gate. Shell it after the next recoil cycle. The order was obeyed. The shell found the buried magazine with impossible certainty. The Basilica gate erupted. From within, its iconography and defenders vanishing into a geyser of smoke, masonry, and meat. This was his power, not gaudy witchfire, not some frothing display meant to impress the ignorant. He was resilience beyond sanity, force concentrated to the point of inevitability, an intellect sharpened until battle itself became material he could shape. He did not conquer through noise. He conquered because he could see the one pressure point that would collapse a whole wall, the one delay that would poison an entire defense sequence, the one structural lie upon which an army's confidence rested. The outer gate bastion named Vortigern stood ahead of him, a fortress knot within the larger line, held to be unassailable while its sister walls still breathed. Its armor face had taken days of punishment and remained. Its void shield had flickered, recovered, and endured. Its inner supports were sunk deep into the bedrock and reinforced by Mechanicus design older than many sectors of the world. Imperial Command had built the surviving line around the certainty that Vortigern would anchor it. Perturabo looked at it and saw where it would die. He altered course by a fraction, not toward the gate itself, where every remaining gun expected the assault, but toward a buttressed side section, half masked by smoke and wreckage. Damek's tactical sense caught up a heartbeat later. The buttress hid a stress seam created when earlier bombardment had warped one load-bearing rib and shifted pressure into the adjoining wall route. No ordinary commander would have risked the focus required to exploit it under that volume of fire. Perturabo did not hesitate. He struck the wall with his hammer. The blow did not simply break stone. It translated force through the seam, through the rib, through the compromised geometry beneath the visible surface. The bastion answered with a deep, cracking groan, like a mountain beginning to fail. He struck again. Armor plate buckled inward. Internal support vaults shattered. A third blow landed, and Vortigern's side wall collapsed, not in a local breach, but in a chain failure that ran through the fortification's heart. Whole sections of the bastion face tore free and came down in slabs the size of hab blocks. Defenders on the parapets vanished beneath falling masonry. Gun crews were pulped at their stations. Men in the gate galleries died not knowing why the wall itself had chosen to kill them. The unassailable bastion opened. Through dust thick with powdered stone and atomized flesh came Damek Vor at the head of his Terminators, forcing the breach with chain fist, bolter, and hammer. He expected no thanks. He knew better. Yet somewhere beneath his discipline, there still lived a hard knot of expectation that the Primarch would mark earlier gains, see the captured redoubts, the measured progress, the kill zones set in proper sequence. Perturabo turned his head slightly as Damek drew near. You advance the western trench, grid 6 minutes ahead of ordered schedule. Damek halted, momentarily thrown by the words amid so much ruin. The enemy line was weakened, immediate pressure secured. Nothing, said Perturabo. It secured nothing. You exposed the left mining teams to counter battery for a gain already accounted for on the original schedule. 211 Legion thralls died for your impatience. 41 engineers, 1 siege auger cohort. Their replacement delayed the undercut by 6 minutes. That delay forced the expenditure of 12 additional breacher charges at Vortigern. Bolter fire cracked around them. Men screamed in the dust. The Primarch's gaze remained fixed on Damek like a drill boring into faulted stone. You mistook motion for efficiency. Do so again, and I will dismantle you. Damek bowed his head, the words burning hotter than any wound. Understood, Lord. See that you do. Then the Black Templars came. Marshal Othmar Kessel had held them in the inner transit galleries, while the outer line suffered and the command bastions argued over reserve timing. Now Vortigern had fallen open, and the Lord of Iron himself stood within the breach. No son of Dawn worthy of gene seed could look upon that and remain behind a wall. Kessel led the charge in person through the shattered gate basilica, black armor streaked with ash and blood, relic blade in both hands, tabard burning at one edge where a shell fragment had ignited it. Around him came his knights and sword brethren, chaplains bellowing litanies through skull helms, initiates and veterans alike, driving forward over broken icons and dead gunners with the unanswerable fury of men who had accepted their deaths before the charge began. For the throne, for Dawn, for the Emperor and the undoing of traitors. They hit the breach like a blade driven into soft tissue. The first iron warriors in their path died hard. One was split from helm to sternum by Kessel himself, the marshal's relic blade punching through ceramite and torso with enough force to shower both sides of the breach in blood. Another Templar shoulder charged a traitor Terminator off his feet and drove a chain blade repeatedly into the abdominal seals until ruptured organs and machine fluid sheeted the wall. Bolters flared at muzzle contact range. Chain teeth screamed. The narrow breach became instantly intimate, a place where giant men butchered giant men in arm's reach, and the air was thick with atomized blood and powdered masonry. Then Othmar Kessel reached Perturabo. The Marshal came with all the force and faith a space marine could gather into flesh, steel, and oath. He struck not as a man, but as a legacy, the wrath of the Imperial fists made incarnate in black plate and sacred fury. His blade would have cut down Damek. It would have gutted any warsmith in the Fourth. It landed upon Perturabo in a shower of sparks and carved a bright line across the Primarch's armor no deeper than a scar in fortress paint. Perturabo struck him once, not with flourish, not with rage, merely with contempt given physical form. The backhand blow smashed Kessel from his feet and hurled him through two of his own sword brethren. Ceramite burst. One Templar's head came off against the wall in a red fan. Kessel hit the broken icon screen of the Basilica Gate hard enough to shatter stone and slide down through a rain of saints' fragments and blood. He rose again. Of course he did. He was a son of Dawn. The Black Templars surged to cover him, hacking at Perturabo's legs, firing into joint seams, throwing themselves bodily against a foe who outweighed them in fate as much as in mass. One managed to drive a power blade into a cable cluster at the Primarch's side. Perturabo crushed his helm and skull together in one gauntleted grip. Another leapt onto the fallen slab beside him and brought a thunderhammer down toward the Primarch's head. Perturabo caught the haft mid-swing, yanked the Templar forward, and drove the broken weapon through his chest so hard the Loyalist lifted clear of the ground before sliding off in two pieces. This was the gulf. Even the finest of the Adeptus Astartes, the most fanatical, the most disciplined, the most willing to die, were still finite things before a Primarch made Daemon without surrendering the cold architecture of his genius. Yet the Templars did not stop. Their courage only made the slaughter more sacred and more terrible. The breach widened behind them. Iron warriors poured through. Fighting spilled into the inner Citadel districts, where the once ceremonial avenues of the capital bastion hive became charnel corridors under emergency lumen and firelight. The walls there were lined with martial statuary, victory niches, command shrines, and devotional iconography to generations of Kelladac's dead defenders. All of it was smashed to ruin in the close fighting. Black Templars and Iron warriors hacked one another apart through galleries choked with stone dust and incense smoke. Ruptured power conduits lashed the air with white arcs, cooking flesh where men grappled too close. Organ matter painted the walls. Chainswords bit through neck seals and shoulder joints. Bolt rounds burst inside torsos at arm's length and through organs across cracked mosaic floors. Men slipped in gore and died on their knees, still trying to fire. In one transit hall, a chaplain of the Templars held a stair mouth alone for 9 heartbeats after every brother around him had died, Crozius rising and falling amid broken teeth and black blood until an Iron warrior's breacher charge turned him and the stair into red smoke and raining bone. In another, a squad of Damek's legionaries forced a sanctum door with melter fire and butchered the defenders within so completely that the command chamber walls ran in curtains of blood from the heat. By the time the fighting ground toward its next line of resistance, the main breach was no longer a breach. It was a wound broad enough for armies. Castor Vale received the reports in fragments because little else remained coherent. Vortigern gone, gate line broken, inner sanctums contested, Black Templars engaged with the Primarch himself, reserve routes compromised, Western District falling, Southern Gallery flooded with traitors. There came a point at which the accumulation of disaster ceased to feel like a sequence and became simply a state of existence. He looked toward the sealed blast shutters of the command chamber, as though stone and steel could keep out the knowledge that now hung over the whole world. Perturabo had come in person, not as a rumor, not as a distant will operating through fleets and warsmiths. He walked upon Kelladac. He had broken its gate bastions with his own hands. He was inside the capital hive. Every soldier on the world knew it by then, whether through Vox report, terrified witness, whispered prayer, or the simple animal knowledge that spread through armies when something greater than doctrine entered the field. The defenders fell back into the heart of the bastion hive, line after line, corridor after corridor, while behind them the dead piled thicker and the walls shook with the tread of iron boots. The Lord of Iron had returned to imperial soil, and Kelladac understood at last that it was not fighting a siege. It was being judged by a Primarch. Kelladac spent its last strength in one convulsion of hatred. There were worlds that died by inches, yielding trench by trench, city by city, until only silence remained to mark the passing of their defiance. Kelladac would not be counted among them. The Bastion world had been bred for resistance, until resistance was the only instinct left in its bones. And when the gate lines failed, when the inner Citadel districts ran red, and the tread of traitor Astartes shook the command vaults, the defenders answered not with surrender, but with a final total violence so complete that for a few terrible hours the whole wounded planet seemed to hurl itself bodily at the invader. The order went out from Bastion Primus through broken Vox channels, hardline relays, runner teams, flare code, shrine bells, and machine cant. Every reserve not already dead or buried was to commit. Every armor cohort still able to move was to roll. Every fortress militia block still holding a weapon was to advance. Skitarii maniples were released from static defense and directed into counter-assault corridors. The surviving night engines, scarred by bombardment and blackened by ash, were awakened from the catacomb vaults beneath the inner bastion hive and sent striding into the war beneath banners already half burned away. The Black Templars gathered again around Marshal Othmar Kessel, with their numbers savaged and their tabards dark with blood, yet no less terrible for being fewer. Lord General Castor Vale stood in the command chamber that had become his tomb in all but certainty, and heard every staff recommendation for evacuation. He dismissed them one by one with the same cold refusal. "There will be no withdrawal to the subcrustal vaults," he said. "There will be no escape convoy. There will be no preservation of command for some later war. We are the later war." A major of fortress artillery, one sleeve soaked black from a wound he had bound with signal cable, swallowed once before speaking. "My lord, if you remain here when the Citadel line fails, the command structure dies with you." Vale looked at the projection of the capital hive and the tightening ring of enemy works around it. There was no vanity in his face, no tragic theatre, only exhaustion burned down to iron. "The command structure is already dying," he said. "The only question left is whether it dies buying minutes or begging for them. Commit the last strategic reserves, all of them." The order spread outward. Ammunition. Vaults were emptied. Tank crews climbed into vehicles already running hot and half repaired. Militia officers dragged coughing laborers and clerks from blackout hab sectors, shoved laser guns into their hands, and marched them toward breach routes under the promise of absolution or execution. Tech priests flensed machine wards from reserve engines and flooded them with stimulant liturgy. In the lower basilicas, chaplains of the Templars spoke the rites of final battle over brothers who already knew they would not see another dawn. Marshal Othmar Kessel knelt for neither prayer nor comfort. He stood before his surviving knights with his sword bare in his gauntlet and his battered helm mag locked to his hip. One side of his breastplate remained dented inward from Perturabo's blow. The ceramite there was cracked, and dried blood darkened the seam beneath it. His voice carried without needing vox amplification. Hate gave it enough force. "If Kelladac dies," he said, "it dies with every traitor choking on its blood. If these walls fall, they fall over mounds of broken heretics so deep that even the damned will need ladders to climb them. There is no retreat. There is no rescue. There is only the Emperor watching to see whether his warriors are worthy of the gene line they bear. A murmur answered him, not uncertain, not afraid. For Dawn, for Sigismund, for the throne. Kessel bared his teeth. Then let the enemy look upon the sons of Dawn one final time, and know why even traitor Primarchs remember fear. The counterstroke began under a roof of artillery. Kelladac's remaining batteries emptied themselves in one vast and disciplined expenditure. Umbrella barrages laid across the inner districts, and the traitor trench belts beyond, in overlapping curtains of fire. Shells screamed low over the retreating loyalist lines and burst ahead in mile-long chains. Trench walls folded. Redoubts vanished in dirty orange upheaval. Whole sections of captured roadway became boiling pits of black mud, fuel fire, and dismembered men. Beneath that storm came the armor. Battle tanks and super-heavy engines rolled from blast doors hidden within the foundations of the capital hive. Their tracks and wheels crushed spent brass, bones, severed limbs, and statuary fragments together into a paste that clung to the plates. Night engines strode between them like wrath-made metal, reactor cores howling, ion shields burning blue-white in the ash dark. Skitarii cohorts advanced beneath the armor canopy in ordered machine lines, galvanic fire already stitching the smoke. Militia blocks followed in their wake by the tens of thousands, stumbling over shell holes and corpse ridges, some weeping, some screaming prayers, some mute with the terror that had at last gone too deep for voice. And for a little while, impossibly, they drove the enemy back. The outer traitor trenches on the inner citadel approach collapsed beneath the weight of tanks and shell fire. Slave levies died by the acre, crushed under treads or blown apart where they huddled in firing bays, not built to withstand armor charge. Iron warriors' gun nests that had ruled the approaches all day vanished under direct battle cannon strikes. A knight-errant split a siege tower from crown to chassis with its chain blade, spilling iron plates, mutilated crews, and burning promethium in a sheet that lit the breach line like a second dawn. In the westward galleries, fortress militia overran a damaged redoubt and bayoneted the surviving cult soldiery against the revetment walls with the mad ferocity of the doomed. It looked, for a handful of bloody minutes, like courage might alter arithmetic. Perturabo had allowed for that as well. From a broken transit tower overlooking the central approaches, the Lord of Iron watched the counterstroke with the measured attention of an engineer observing weight settle onto a bridge he had secretly undermined days before. Around him, shells burst, bolter fire cracked, and the ground shook beneath the passage of engines. He neither flinched nor hurried. "Let them advance," he said. Warsmiths and battery masters obeyed, though some did so with reluctance sharp enough to border on fear. Iron warriors' trench crews abandoned firing lips by planned sequence. Siege guns fell silent at ordered moments. A breach corridor opened where the Loyalists most desired one, broad and bloody, and apparently fragile. Imperial armor rushed into it with all the zeal of starving men seeing bread. Then the kill lattice closed. Trenches that seemed shattered gave way beneath the weight of advancing tanks, their support walls blown beforehand so that entire sections collapsed into charnel pits filled with sharpened iron, demolition charges, and the rotting dead. Lead vehicles vanished nose first into those pits and were swallowed under avalanches of earth and armor and meat. Behind them, false breaches in the traitor line narrowed into murder funnels marked days ago for overlapping fire. Hidden demon engines rose from camouflaged shell scrapes and dead vehicle berms, their furnace maws vomiting streams of fire into the packed infantry following the armor. Collapsed tunnels under the route of advance detonated in staggered sequence, dropping whole militia battalions into smoking cavities before secondary charges folded the earth over them again. Artillery that had seemed silenced came alive from new angles. Pre-ranged batteries fired in mathematically precise intervals. Shells landed not on the leading edge of the Loyalist push, but behind it, severing withdrawal routes, smashing reserve columns, and driving every formation deeper into the lattice. Gun arcs overlapped from captured bastions, trench redoubts, orbital stations, and the first geostationary fortress hanging over the world like an iron moon. Tanks burned in clusters where they had bottlenecked between collapsed hab blocks and mine belts. Skitari. Maniples were cut apart in squares so perfect that their dismembered bodies looked laid down by a draftsman of murder rather than by chance. The battle became the worst kind of war. Not movement, consumption. Trenches caved inward under the recoil of too many guns and filled with the living and the dead together, men drowning face first in blood and wet black earth, while those behind climbed over their backs to keep moving. Tanks ploughed through mounds of corpses so deep their tracks lost purchase and spun, flinging gobbets of flesh and snapped bones high into the firelight. Chain blades chewed through rib cages in close-packed fighting pits where there was no room to swing wide. Ceramite boots pulped skulls on stairways already slick with brains and teeth. One entire militia regiment disappeared when an artillery concentration found them crossing an avenue between ruin blocks and turned the formation into a red vapor cloud through which only scraps of uniform cloth drifted down. At the eastern trench mouths, Black Templars and Iron Warriors met again at sword reach. Kessel drove at the fore with his surviving household like a spear tip of black iron and oath. His brothers hacked through traitor legionaries, through cult rabble, through slave handlers, through any shape of flesh that stood between them and the towering outline they saw ahead beyond the smoke. "Forward!" Kessel roared, as a bolt shell glanced from his pauldron and burst the helm of the brother at his right. "Forward until your heart stop, or the traitors does." They obeyed as only the sons of dawn could obey. They crossed ditches full of their own dead. They fought through a trench where the walls had been mortared with bodies and iron spoil together. They climbed over a wrecked predator still burning from within and hit a line of Iron Warriors' breaches so hard that both sides vanished into a tangle of sawing chain teeth, stabbing combat blades, and point-blank gunfire. One Templar lost both legs to a melter burst and still dragged himself into an enemy gun pit to detonate a crack charge in his own fist. Another took a chain axe through the abdomen, killed the traitor wielding it, and kept fighting with his guts hanging hot and black over the torn lower edge of his cuirass. Damek Vor fought in the western pressure corridor where the Imperial counterstroke had bitten deepest. He saw the command citadel through the smoke at last, its upper towers cracked, its shield vanes flickering under strain, its walls still manned by defenders too stubborn or too damned to quit their guns. Glory whispered in the old savage part of him then. One hard thrust, one personal spear cast into the command heart, to be the warsmith who tore open Kelladac's brain while all eyes watched. He raised his hammer and voxed for his terminators to form on him. "Drive for the Citadel," he ordered. "The line bends. We finish it before the others can claim the kill." A second later, the Primarch's voice cut across every channel in his helm, colder than void iron. "You will hold position." Damek's jaw clenched. "The command bastion is exposed. Immediate exploitation is vanity." Perturabo's reply came without heat, which made it worse. "The encirclement is not complete. Your advance would puncture the pressure ring before the southern teeth close. Hold. Bleed them. Let the world seal around itself." For one heartbeat, Damek hated him with the hot, useless hate of a son who knows his father sees through him absolutely. He could feel the citadel ahead. He could imagine its fall. He could almost taste the moment. Then the wider tactical display updated. He saw the truth at once and knew how close he had come to stupidity. The Loyalist counterstroke had driven exactly where Perturabo wished it. The southern trench sectors and the underhive breach galleries were seconds from closure. If Damek lunged for the citadel too early, the defenders would have a corridor to collapse back through, a crack in the iron ring, a route by which command and surviving armor might yet escape into the subcrustal belts. The proper kill was not a beheading strike, it was strangulation. He lowered his hammer. "Hold position," he voxed, bitterness flooding his mouth like acid. "No advance beyond marker line. Kill all who enter." Elsewhere, the Mechanicus made its own last gamble. In the deepest command sanctums of the Forge network, Magos Dominus Acast Rho. 71 plugged his mechadendrites into the scuttle architecture and initiated the code sequence that would deny Kelladac's industrial heart to the enemy. Plasma induction overloads, reactor spiking, magazine purges, data vault cremation, collapse charges in the primary foundry vaults. He would burn the world's productive soul rather than let it be profaned. "Commence total denial," he intoned in machine cant. "By the Omnissiah preserved, let function end before corruption reigns." The code did not obey him. For a moment the sequence appeared to engage. Then command runes changed shape on the slate glass. Return signals came back wrong. Not resistance, mockery. Data paths forked where no paths should have existed. Forge cores that should have entered melt cascade instead vented pressure into civilian hab sectors. Ammunition reserves primed for purgation detonated in militia mustering yards. Shield relays overloaded not outward toward the void, but inward through the fortress grids, blasting command bunkers and medici stations into storms of shrapnel and white fire. One reactor hold collapsed under its own emergency suppressors and buried 3 whole Skitari cohorts beneath molten machinery. Caudal Hex's voice rolled across the corrupted channels in a whisper of Binharic blasphemy and furnace laughter. "Your purity was opened days ago, Magos." Acast tried to sever the lines. His own systems locked him in place. Data. Spikes drove through his cortex manifold. Warning sigils filled his vision until all he could see were red runes and his own rising error chants. When the first secondary detonations reached the command levels, he was still trying to force obedience from a machine world that had already chosen a different master. Lord General Castor Vale felt the floor lurch beneath the command chamber and knew the forges had failed. Dust streamed from the cracked ceiling. One wall display burst in a spray of sparks. Half the officers on the lower tier vanished in a wash of white light as an internal conduit ruptured and tore them open to the bone. Still, he remained over the tactical table, blood on one cheek, one hand flat to the shaking surface as he continued issuing coordinates. "Battery Malachor, fire on my mark, shift 2 streets north. No, farther. They are using the Basilica ruins as cover. Burn through the nave and the district behind it. Do it now." A staff captain, one arm hanging by, tendons, stared at him as though at something inhuman. "My lord, the southern vaults have collapsed. We have no reserve left to commit." "Then commit the dead if they can still stand." Vale coughed blood into his fist and wiped it on his coat. "Western Towers, new target package. Range the geostationary fortress if the shields are down. I want it hurt, even if I cannot kill it." The chamber shook again. This time the ceiling split. Stone, adamant struts and burning cabling came down in a roar. Officers disappeared mid-sentence. A Vox servitor was crushed so completely that its wet components sprayed across the plotter bank in a burst of red and machine oil. Vale was thrown to one knee, rose, and kept speaking while masonry smashed the dais around him. "Fire," he said into the smoke and thunder. "Fire until the rest of the order vanished under the collapse. Bastion Primus buried its master where he stood, still giving coordinates to guns that even then were falling silent one by one. With the command corps gone, the defenders broke into islands. Some fought on in blind pockets, never learning the world had already died around them. Some were trapped in galleries sealed by cave-ins and spent their last ammunition killing one another when the air ran thin. Some withdrew by doctrine into fallback chambers that opened upon iron warriors' trench mouths already prepared to receive them. Everywhere, Infrastructure failed. Tunnels fell in. Lift shafts dropped whole platoons into darkness. Rail lines blew apart under sabotage charges and left evacuation convoys burning in place. What had once been a coherent bastion hive became a crushed anatomy of isolated organs, each one bleeding out alone. Above, the planetary shield grid collapsed. It did not fail gracefully. It guttered. Vast blue domes over the capital and surviving fortress districts wavered under internal overloads, flickered in violent spasms, and then died in ragged sequence. Across the world, for the first time since the siege began, nothing remained between Kelladac and the full appetite of the fleet in orbit. Orbital fire came down like the verdict of a god that had never known mercy. Lance strikes speared through hive crowns and left them burning from within. Macro salvos flattened whole districts already contested by infantry, turning victor and defender alike into mixed strata beneath avalanches of shattered ferrocrete. The geostationary fortress above the equatorial belt joined the bombardment with deliberate, unhurried malice, its batteries walking across the surviving wall lines until those walls ceased to exist in any meaningful architectural form. And through all of it, the iron ring closed. The southern teeth met the western trenches. The orbital bastions locked their fire arcs over the last void ports. Captured rail junctions were reversed into choke points. The capital hive and the surviving fortress districts found themselves girdled by trenchworks, guns, mine belts, demon engines and artillery towers in a complete encirclement no courage could break and no relief could reach in time. Kelladac had wanted one final battle. Perturabo had allowed it. Now he sealed the wound and watched it bleed out. The last Black Templars found him in the ruins of a transit square where the stone had been pounded flat by bombardment and the statues of dead governors lay toppled among heaps of bodies. Kessel came at the front again, limping now, one arm hanging partly numb, his armor split in a dozen places, but his eyes still alive with that terrible, loyal fury. Around him gathered what remained of his brethren, a black knot of warriors reduced by half and half again, yet still advancing, as if the numbers mattered. They struck Perturabo in full view of both armies. No speech passed between them, no ritual challenge. Such things belonged to cleaner wars and smaller men. Kessel's blade came in low, seeking the compromised line. His earlier strike had scarred. A Templar thunderhammer smashed into Perturabo's side with enough force to crack the paving for meters around. Another drove a power sword into a knee joint and burned the edge white, trying to force it deeper. Loyalist bolters fired point blank into the Primarch's torso until the air was all sparks and shattered casing brass. Perturabo killed them with the indifference of an execution device. He seized the thunderhammer bearer by the throat and pulped him against the ground until armor and body lost distinction. He stamped once, and the Templar at his knee came apart from pelvis to helm, crushed into the stone in a fan of burst organs and broken ceramite. He caught Kessel's next blow on the haft of his own weapon, turned with monstrous economy, and hammered the Marshal across the chest. The impact caved Kessel's breastplate fully inward and hurled him through two brothers and a fallen statue plinth. When the Marshal tried to rise again, Perturabo walked to him and struck him down once more, this time taking head and shoulder away in the same ruinous blow. The rest died around their lord's body, not because their courage could alter the outcome, but because courage was the only wealth they still possessed. Silence followed that slaughter in widening circles, broken only by distant guns and the hiss of burning wreckage. Even the Iron Warriors paused, if only for a heartbeat, as the last sons of dawn on Kelladac lay broken among the dead. Perturabo looked out over the capital hive, over the burning districts, the collapsing forts, the trenches heavy with corpses, and the orbital fire still falling through the failure of the shields. His voice went out across the system in cold command, carried by Vox towers, fleet relays, and captured command nets. Kelladac is sentenced. Its old name remains only for the record of its failure. By my will, It is the first stone of the infinite citadel. There was no triumph in the words, no exultation. They were spoken as one might pronounce a wall condemned for demolition or an enemy fortress marked on a plan for reduction. A fact, a sentence, a use assigned. And beneath the raining fire of heaven, the Bastion world began to understand that even in defeat, it had not reached an ending. It had merely become material. There was no peace upon Kelladac after the guns fell quiet enough for men to hear themselves think. Silence did not come in mercy. It came in shifts, broken by the grind of excavators, the shriek of cutting beams, the bark of execution volleys, the coughing thunder of demolition charges, and the dull rhythmic beat of industrial machinery starting again over fields where the dead still lay in drifts. The battle had ended only in the narrow military sense. What followed was worse than battle, because battle at least offered the thin dignity of resistance. Occupation under the Iron Warriors offered only use. The world was sorted. Columns of survivors were driven from the ruins of the capital hive and the surviving fortress districts under guard by traitor auxilia, chained overseers and Iron Warriors legionaries who watched the masses with the hard indifference of men inspecting raw material. The wounded who could still stand were beaten into labor lines. Those who could not were dragged toward the servitor pits or the corpse-rendering furnaces, depending on whether their flesh looked healthy enough for augmetic preservation. Children were measured by height, dentition, and apparent strength, then marked with brands denoting future allocation. Ammunition bearing, trench spoil removal, cable dragging, furnace feeding. Bodies too small or malformed for long labor were taken elsewhere and did not return. The living were broken down into castes, with the same logic used to classify shell calibers or bridge load tolerances, labor hands, penal assault stock, food reclamation biomass, mechanized conversion stock, ritual, consumption reserve. The old names of families, regiments, guilds and districts vanished in the allocation ledgers. All that mattered now was function and loss expectation. The dead became useful as well. Corpse-rendering pits opened in the shadow of ruined cathedrals. Steam rose from them day and night. The smell reached everywhere, a greasy sweetness of boiled marrow, blood rot, burned fat and chemical preservatives. Bodies were tipped in by the thousands, loyalist and traitor together, militia beside legion thrall, priest beside laborer, all reduced to slurry, nutrient stock, tallow, bone aggregate and fuel supplements for the manufactoria. Where mass graves had formed in collapsed trench sectors, excavation gangs did not bury them deeper. They stripped the remains into carts for sorting, long bones for grinding, teeth for recovery, fat for rendering, flesh for the pits. Fragments too small to classify were shoveled into lime trenches or mixed with ferrocrete and spoil to thicken the foundations of the new wall lines. Perturabo had ordered Kelladac remade, and the order moved across the planet with the force of weather. Cathedrals to the Emperor were stripped down to their load-bearing columns and external buttresses, their sanctums gutted, their altars smashed, their bells melted for shell metal, their towers widened into gun platforms. Hab sprawls were skinned to ferrocrete skeletons and then cut into measured fighting blocks, every civilian sprawl that had once implied life reduced to hard angles of defense and overlapping kill lanes. Whole districts were flattened not because they resisted, but because their geometry displeased the plan. Rail lines were rerouted to feed new bastion teeth. Streets became trench mouths. Civic plazas became artillery aprons. The old wall networks, once built according to the strategic habits of the Imperium, were not merely repaired, they were corrected. Continental wall lines began as scars visible from the upper atmosphere. The first were cut across the western ash plains, where the counterstroke had died. Labor castes hauled spoil under the lash, while crawler rigs drove pilings deep into the bedrock. Gun towers rose behind them in stages. Prefabricated black iron segments locked together by servo cranes and rank upon rank of chained workers. Those who fell into the wet foundations were left there. Those too slow to keep the pace were shot and packed into retaining trenches. The work was paid for in blood, because the Lord of Iron considered blood a plentiful mortar. Warsmith Damek IV rode the reconstruction corridors in a tracked command carrier with the top hatches open, looking out over the conquered world as it changed shape beneath brutal necessity. He had thought himself familiar with atrocity. He had spent centuries in the service of Medangard. He had broken cities and star forts and hive belts across half the galaxy. Yet Kelladac's aftermath revealed a particular horror that belonged to the Iron Warriors alone. They did not burn a world and leave. They stayed. They taught it a worse purpose. He passed a sorting ground where the dead were stacked in corded layers by size and decomposition state beneath fluttering strips of hazard cloth. Nearby, the living were yoked to trench rollers and made to pack the same dead into anti-vehicle ditches until the ditch line rose like a dark, unnatural embankment. He passed a child tally station where scribes and overseers marked columns of shaven-headed juveniles with iron stamps, while nearby servitors loaded shell crates onto rail slings. He passed the remains of a district where the walls had been sheared away from hab blocks, leaving bare room grids exposed to the air like the cells of a butchered hive. Workers swarmed over them, fitting gun embrasures where family shrines had once stood. No lament rose from those places. Lament required the belief that appeal might matter. The world had gone beyond lament into numb, mechanical suffering. Caudal Hex thrived in it. The warpsmith had taken the surviving forge hollows beneath the central districts and transformed them into birthing pits for new engines. Damek descended into one such forge cavern and found the air hot enough to warp the paint from his armor. Suspended over a furnace lake hung the half-made body of a demon engine, its limbs not yet fully articulated, its hull plates still glowing from recent welding. Chains thicker than a man's torso held it in place, while robed adepts scuttled below, carrying censers of burning oil and pails filled with blood siphoned fresh from execution pens. The machine's eye sockets were dark, yet something behind them moved, not motion of motor or piston, anticipation. Caudal Hex approached amid a rustle of mechadendrites and vox clicks. Kelladac's own forge matrices proved receptive after correction. Its machine spirits resisted at first. Resistance has now been classified as irrelevant. One of the adepts below began to chant. The words were Binharic, mutilated by syllables no proper priest of Mars would ever permit into the liturgy. A second answered, then a third. The chains above the unfinished engine creaked. Steam burst from its vent stacks, though no pressure command had been issued. Something within the furnace lake below howled back. "You are binding warp entities into local manufacture already," Damek said. "Already." Caudal's mask grill vented a pale jet of heat. "Why import what can be grown? Kelladac will birth its own hatred now." The engine opened its eyes. Red light flooded the cavern. Men on the lower gantries flinched. One adept dropped his sensor and tried to run. A chain lashed down from nowhere the eye could follow and tore him in half at the waist. The engine had not even been fully released from its cradle, and already it had learned appetite. Damek watched without surprise. This, too, was Iron Warrior's victory. Industry taught to hate. Production lines made sentient in the worst possible way. The world was beginning to feel alive beneath the reconstruction, not in any wholesome or organic sense, but as a fortress organism did, hateful, wakeful, and hungry for the next war. Perturabo was not pleased. Victory had never pleased him. Utility did for a time, but only until inefficiency showed itself. The War Council convened within the stripped shell of Kelladac's central fortress district, where the old command sanctum had been rebuilt into a chamber of black iron, tactical projectors, and execution posts. Warsmiths and fleet tyrants stood beneath a ceiling still scarred by bombardment, while Perturabo reviewed tonnage figures, attrition ledgers, trench progress curves, and manufactorial output projections. A captain of the siege auxiliaries reported that one of the western labor sectors had failed to meet wall depth quotas due to excessive tool breakage and worker mortality. Perturabo looked at him once. "You are describing results as though they excuse cause. My lord, the available stock was below. Then you misallocated stock." The captain tried to continue. He managed 3 more words before Perturabo shot him through the chest with a wrist-mounted weapon at such close range that the body burst backward in a spray of ribs, lungs, and armor fragments. No one moved to remove the corpse until the Primarch had finished speaking. "A world taken means nothing," he said. "A world converted into a stronger wall means something. If it cannot support the next war, then this war was waste. Waste is theft from future victory." His gaze moved across the chamber. Damek felt it pass over him like a cutting beam. "Remember this. There is no conquest. There is only continuation." Later, during the rededication of the central fortress district, the last act of Kelladac's loyalty came crawling out of the ruins. It was a knot of survivors, no larger than a single assault. Squad by strict number, though the hatred in them made them feel larger when they struck. A handful of fortress officers, 3 black-armored survivors of Kessel's crusade, several Skitari, whose doctrine had not yet been obliterated by network corruption, and 1 old artillery priest dragging a melter gun too heavy for his ruined leg. They had hidden in maintenance shafts beneath the district, while the Iron Warriors rebuilt overhead. They had watched the banners of the 4th rise over the broken Citadel and chosen not escape, but murder. As Perturabo stood upon the remade platform where once Kelladac's governors had sworn fealty to Terra, the survivors emerged through service ducts and rubble mouths in a sudden burst of disciplined fire. The Skitari opened first, galvanic rounds hissing across the square toward command attendants and signal relays. The artillery priest fired his melter beam at the Primarch's flank and turned one section of the platform parapet into running metal. The surviving Templars came behind the shot in utter silence, their blades raised, helm lenses bright in the smoke, charging as men charge when they know absolutely that they are already dead. For a heartbeat, the square became battle again. Iron Warriors' guards died. One had his throat and spine severed in the same strike. Another vanished beneath a torrent of galvanic fire that punched through his helm and chest in crackling bursts. The artillery priest took a bolt shell through the gut, stayed upright by fury alone, and dragged the beam of his weapon upward across a signal mast, slicing it in half before a second round removed most of his head. The Templars reached Perturabo. One drove a blade into the inner elbow joint of his armor and managed to bite deep enough to spray sparks and black fluid. Another leapt for the gorget, chain teeth shrieking. It would have been a magnificent attack against any lesser being. Perturabo annihilated them in silence. He broke the first across his knee and cast both halves aside. He caught the second by the faceplate and crushed until helm, skull, and hand joined in one red metal ruin. The third landed a strike at the shoulder seam and died for it when the Primarch's hammer turned his torso into vaporized meat and armor scrap. The remaining officers and Skitari were gunned down by the Iron Warriors' guard before they could even regroup. In less than 10 heartbeats, the square was still again, except for the hiss of blood on hot metal. Perturabo looked upon the bodies as one might look upon insects that had reached a table leg before being stamped flat. Then he ordered the corpses hung from the outer wall with their bones exposed. "Let them remain visible," he said. "The Sons of Dawn, the priesthood of Terra, and every fortress world that still believes walls alone can save it, will learn what follows when I do not merely conquer. They will learn what it is when I stay." The war council that followed revealed the full shape of the thing. Kelladac had never been the prize. It had been the anchor. Hololithic projections rose above the council chamber, showing not one world, but chains of them, bastion worlds, forge systems, void choke points, and defense thresholds deeper into the war zone beyond the old Cadian approaches. Lines of transit, resource veins, siege corridors, worlds to be broken and remade into linked stations of iron. Orbital fortresses, placed not as isolated trophies, but as nodes in a widening architecture meant to make advance and entrenchment the same act. "The first stone is placed," Perturabo said. "The second and third will follow. Each world will support the next. Each fortress will feed another farther inward. Their walls will become my road." A fleet tyrant inclined his helm. "Toward Cadia's corpse roots, Lord." "Beyond them?" Another warsmith dared to ask. "Toward Terra." Perturabo's expression did not alter. "Toward whatever remains to be taken." Damek stood among the gathered commanders, and at last understood the truth with a clarity that stripped away even resentment. There would be no reward for Kelladac, no feast of conquest, no season of consolidation, no rest purchased by service. This world would become useful, and because it was useful, it would be consumed into the next undertaking. The labor lines would lengthen, the forges would multiply, the dead would be mortared into new walls. Then another world would suffer the same, then another. To serve Perturabo was not to win and be honored. It was merely to remain useful long enough to be included in the next calculation. There was no peace in that, no completion, only continuation inside a war machine so immense that planets were no more than components and lives no more than aggregate. From orbit, Kelladac was already becoming something else. The geostationary bastions ringed it in hard black stations of iron and gunfire. New wall lines scored the continents in ruler straight wounds that glinted under the pale star. The old fortress patterns of the Imperium were disappearing beneath fresh angles, deeper trenches, broader artillery aprons, and the beginnings of mountain-scale citadels raised where command hives had once stood. Cargo streams moved ceaselessly between orbit and surface. New fortress modules descended in burning lines. The world did not look occupied. It looked reforged. And beyond it, in the dark between stars, routes were already being measured for the next stone, and the next after that, until one distant day, the road of fortresses might stretch all the way to Terra, and the Imperium would look back along its own strangled frontiers and see that the Lord of Iron had not been raiding its borders at all. He had been building an empire of siege from the carcasses of its worlds.